Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. On today's episode, we are talking about pay inequity, the fact that women still earn considerably less than men in similarly situated jobs. And my guest to help us through this topic is Lucy Marsh. She is a professor of law at the University of Denver Sturm Law School. And more importantly, even than that, she was the plaintiff on behalf of herself and a number of other female law professors who brought a successful case against the university alleging and proving that women law professors at the school were paid considerably less than the male professors at the school. Resulted in a significant settlement and bringing light to this issue in that community. We talk about her case and the broader implications, some of the reasons why these cases don't get brought as much as they should, despite the widespread problem throughout our workforce, why mothers and fathers and daughters and sons need to know that they have rights to equal pay and that there can't be discrimination on the basis of gender in terms of pay. All of this makes for a fascinating conversation with Professor Lucy Marsh. Stay tuned. I hope you'll enjoy. Welcome back to Good Law, Bad Law. Today we're going to be discussing the gender pay gap and the Equal Pay Act of 1963 in particular, and even more in particular, a case involving not just a person and a group of individuals who claim inequality in pay, but a law professor and a law school in a successful case that sought a remedy for years of inequality in pay. And that is my introduction to my guest on this episode, Lucy Marsh, a professor of law at the University of Denver Sturm Law School. Lucy, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law today.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
This is a fascinating case, and we do often hear about gender pay inequity, the gender pay gap in some general terms, but I thought this was a really great opportunity to get a little bit inside a specific case that illustrates the problem and what you and a group of your fellow female law professors at the law school did about it and did about it successfully. So it's a great opportunity to look at your experience and hopefully then broaden out from that specific experience to understand more generally the problem we still face in this country involving gender pay inequity. I looked up some numbers this morning, and I think we'll have a chance to get at some of these in more detail as we go along, but I think it's pretty well set that when the gender pay gap law was passed in 1963, women on average were earning something like 60 cents for every dollar a man was earning in a similar job, in a similarly situated employment position. And although there's been some improvement in those numbers, the gap between what men and women earn today in similar jobs is still substantial and is even more significant for women of color compared to white men in similar jobs. So this still remains a big issue for us. I wonder, as we get into some of the details of the case that you and the other female law professors at your school brought against the University of Denver, before we get into the details of that, would you give us a little background on yourself and what you teach and how you came to the law and some of the activities that you have been engaged in at the law school?
Well, I've been teaching law at the University of Denver for more than 40 years, and I also did some visitorships at other schools just for the fun of it. So I now teach property, civil procedure, trust and estates, and I run a wills lab clinic to do wills for low-income people in Denver, and a tribal wills project that's been to 6 different states so far. doing wills on reservations for tribal members.
Well, that part's fascinating, and a lot of law schools have practical clinics where law students rather can practice being lawyers with real cases, with real clients. The tribal program sounds fascinating. Can you say a little bit more about what that involves?
Well, we, at the invitation of various tribes, we've been to Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, Montana, Utah. I'm leaving one out. South Dakota.
Mm-hmm.
For doing wills, because tribal members have more need for wills than the rest of us, because when they own trust land, which is held in trust by the federal government, if they don't have a will, nearly all of that trust land goes only to the one oldest child,
mm-hmm.
and nothing to the surviving spouse, nothing to the other kids. And so that's a really bad situation for tribal members. And then every place we've worked, there's some sort of a taboo against even speaking of death. And so tribal members are not accustomed to doing wills.
Mm.
And just the short time we've been in existence, that taboo seems to be dissipating quite a bit.
Well, that's a problem generally with people when they really should be thinking about their futures, and the fact that we are all going to die at some point, and what that means for our families. It's sort of the elephant in the room that no one wants to talk about, but fascinating that it's even more because of cultural and perhaps religious issues, that's even more of a problem in Native American culture and in some of the tribes you've worked with. How do you deal with that? How do you try to address that taboo, or how have you tried to address that taboo?
Well, before we go to work with any specific tribe, we get some history and culture lectures by somebody who is a member of that tribe,
Mm-hmm.
who tells us the various customs and taboos. And then we try, we're writing wills, but we try very hard not to use the word death, which is kind of cumbersome. and we just try to emphasize what would you like to do with your property when you pass on, or who would you like to be in charge. And the clients, as the students do the interview, the clients generally loosen up a bit so that they feel more comfortable talking about it. But when we were in Montana fairly recently, I was just supposed to talk to a group of elderly people, and we didn't expect any of them to do wills. But after I chatted for a while and I said, does anybody want a will? Virtually all of them stood up, and we weren't prepared to do that many, but we managed it. But a number of the men who were 50 or older came up to me privately and said they weren't quite ready yet to risk doing a will, because the idea is if you speak of death, that means you're ready for death, and so death will come, and so it's kind of a risky business for them to do a will. So we just try to be really tactful and go about it in the most gentle way that we can.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Well, let's talk about the case. This was a case that you and a number of other female law professors brought against the University of Denver, and it resulted, as I understand it, last year in a $2.6 million settlement. So give us some of the background on what the situation was at the University of Denver and how that led to you and others becoming involved in this litigation.
Well, I must say I was not the one who realized there was a disparity. A colleague of mine named Ann Scales, when the dean announced that there was a little extra money to give some raises, she sent an email and said, could you assure us that women are being paid equally? And he didn't answer. And then she was a little more straightforward about it, and he still didn't answer. And every time he didn't answer, the red flag kind of went up. And we said, what's he hiding? And then Ann Scales died very suddenly and unexpectedly. Her last email to the dean was, it's not a consideration, it's the law. And then about 3 days later, she died. And so I decided it was time for somebody to pick up, the banner and keep asking questions, which I did. And then ultimately, the dean did send out a memo to the entire faculty at the end of a really deadly dull memo. He said, oh, by the way, and then it gave us the numbers that that women full professors were being paid distinctly less than men full professors. And I decided somebody ought to do something about it. So I talked to the dean and I said, what are we going to do about it? And he said, nothing. And I decided, you just wait and see. And so then I filed a charge with the EEOC, and I asked my lawyers to draft that charge to make it clear to EEOC that I was not the only one affected. I didn't ask anybody else to join me, and nobody offered to join me, because it's kind of a dangerous thing to sue your employer.
Mm-hmm. And this is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, where you filed the claim initially. Mm.
And so they did make that finding after doing a lot of investigation that indeed it appeared that women faculty were being paid less. And then they tried to run through conciliation with the university, which they're required to do. And the university still wouldn't back down.
Mm-hmm.
And they said some dreadful things. When I filed the charge, then the university sent out a memo to nearly all of our grads and all our students saying, well, this Lucy Marsh, she's been substandard since day one, which was, pretty awful thing to say.
Mm-hmm.
And they had given me the Excellence in Teaching Award 3 years before.
Wow.
So I wasn't too worried. But all at once they seemed to have discovered that I was a bad teacher after 40-some years. And so that created a wonderful backlash from former students who were emailing me, calling me, writing from all over the country saying that's just not true. And so I would have thought the university would have learned its lesson. And a bunch of big donors said they're not giving any more to the law school.
Well, that's hitting the university where it hurts, right?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
That's where they feel it.
Right. Well, let's back up a little bit. So this started with the university and because really we're talking about was it just the law school or was this university wide, first of all?
The case is just against the law school.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I think the problem is university wide, but
mm-hmm.
I could only bring a charge for myself, and so the case itself is just against the law school.
And the amount of money that we're talking about, so I think perhaps sometimes folks might think, what are we really complaining about here? But the dollars at issue were actually pretty substantial. I guess these are the part of what the findings were by the EEOC when it did its investigation. But it looked at the median salary for female full professors and compared to male full professors, and found that the gap between what women were earning compared to men was something like $7,500 a year.
Yes.
Right, and depending on whether you counted before or after raises were given out, the number actually climbed to over $11,000 a year. So this is not a small amount of money. This is a significant pay gap.
And of course the problem is that pay gap had been going on for years.
Mm-hmm.
And so when the pay is less, then the retirement benefits are less and all that kind of stuff.
Well, right, and again, the issue. I was doing some looking around this morning on this. The issue isn't just salary for 1 year. I mean, first of all, you're pointing out that it's not just a salary for 1 year; it's a salary for year after year after year. But also the impact of that is women earning less year in and year out compared to men. Of course, if you project that out over a lifetime, we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars potentially that a woman is earning less than a male counterpart, or that a woman is losing out on in terms of her pay. And that in turn can impact all sorts of things like Social Security benefits, which after all is calculated based on the amount of your earnings. So if you earn less than you should, assuming enforcement of a law from 1963 that says that there shouldn't be discrimination in pay based on gender, that's going to affect how much retirement you're going to get, how much retirement benefits you're going to get in terms of Social Security. So this is a problem that has wide implications, broad implications over the working life and even into retirement for people who are earning less than they should be earning.
Yes, and of course that's true in all professions, where any kind of a job, when there is that pay discrimination, it has a large impact.
So the response, when you bring this type of a claim, you're alleging discrimination, and in order to defend themselves and say, this isn't a case of discrimination, the way the law works in this area is that they have to come up with, that is here, the university has to come up with a non-discriminatory explanation for the discrepancy between pay to men and to women. And right, I mean that's just the way the burden shifts in these kinds of cases. But in these kinds of cases, but here you're saying the non-discriminatory explanation the university came up with was that the women were not doing as good a job as the men, and that justified the lower pay?
That's what they tried, and the facts were quite to the opposite. It was a very strong group of women, and after the EEOC had accepted the case, then other women on the faculty joined, 2 at a time or 3 at a time or something. So it ended up to be 3 different women, all who had very strong track records at the university. So there really was no question on the facts that the women had been doing just as good a job as the men. But the university kept trying to, bury its head in the sand and pretend that wasn't the case.
Well,
and again, I was pleased with the support from students throughout. I was the only one who was named, and the other women faculty felt that people thought they were substandard because the university had called me substandard. But because I was named, I got huge outpouring of support, and walked into my class one day after it had hit the newspaper that the EEOC was taking the case, and there was a big bouquet of flowers on the podium, which is not usual, and a standing ovation from everybody in class.
Wow.
So the students had a couple of petitions that they sent around. So there was no question that our track record at the university was very strong. And one summer, 23 faculty members sent a letter supporting us to the chancellor and saying, look, we know these people. We know they're doing a good job. Why are you dragging this thing out to hurt the university's reputation?
Yeah. Well, and that's a fascinating way in which your case is different from the experience of a lot of people who would allege discrimination in the workplace, in that if you want to look at the performance reviews of an employee, let's say a woman, alleges that she's being discriminated against, and the company then says, well, no, it's not discrimination, actually, it's performance related. What does that employee typically have to work with? They have their employment reviews, which are created by their employers, right? So, in other words, they don't have a lot of outside resources they can turn to say, no, she's really doing a fantastic job. She has to turn to the same person that she's alleging discrimination against, whereas you have the ultimate authority on your job performance, which is what your students have to say. And so
I think that's right.
You had access to a lot of performance reviews, in a sense, outside the traditional employer or employer supervisor who reviews the performance of an employee. You had all your students, you had donors, other faculty members who could weigh in, and it seems like that was something that was pretty important in defeating the university's claims that it was acting in a way that wasn't discriminatory.
I think that's right, and I think it also helped that there were 8 of us. In other words, when there's just one person, they can say, well, you didn't do quite enough of this, or you didn't do quite enough of that. And then when you have 8 people and the result is still all 8 are being paid less than they should be paid, that makes it strong. So there's some strength in numbers.
Absolutely. Okay, so how this case resolved, I guess, by settlement sometime mid last year, how have you seen things change since then?
Well, that's been very entertaining because the EEOC did a very good job on this. And one of the things they did is say that the university was they were going to be monitored for the next 6 years to make sure that they didn't slip and that they did comply with this. And the university has not been doing what it should have done by various states. It's been behind on everything. But one of the things that the EEOC insisted on is that salaries be more transparent. And so they had to disclose salaries by gender and date of hire. And, of course, we've been able to figure out who's who on most of those salaries. Mm-hmm. And it turns out everybody is mad now. And it turns out that, yes, women were being discriminated against most, but also there was no pattern in how the males were getting paid. It just seems to be, did the dean like somebody? Fine. Nice high salary. Did the dean not like somebody? Low salary. So that I think it has had unexpected consequences that the entire faculty is in uproar now to try to figure out some system of pay that will be fair to everyone. And it's not just a matter of favoritism.
What was the attitude of some of the male faculty? I mean, clearly they were benefiting from this inequity, but at the same time, you would think there would be a sense of collegiality among all the members of the faculty, even in a situation like this. What did you find was the attitude of some of the male professors on the faculty?
Well, to some extent, there was that collegiality. Mm-hmm. And one professor, for example, we had a meeting on this, a symposium or something a few weeks ago, and he said he would be embarrassed to be working at a school that was not paying faculty fairly. During the litigation itself, a couple of people came to me and closed the office door and then offered support. But it was dangerous for people to support my efforts publicly because it was pretty clear that the dean was just paying people he liked more than people he didn't like. And so it's dangerous to be supporting me.
Dangerous in the sense that if you step out publicly and support, you're worried about some kind of retaliation?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right.
Because it was clear from the bit of data that was at the beginning of the lawsuit that salaries were not set on an objective basis.
Well, and I think that's probably a factor that would keep down a lot of people that have valid complaints. And we sometimes, as a culture, think that too many people are filing lawsuits. But I actually think that, if anything, there are far fewer people filing claims who actually have valid claims. But there are all kinds of reasons that make it difficult for someone to file a claim. That person who perhaps doesn't have the support of 6 or 7 or 8 other coworkers and worries not only about retaliation in her current employment, but if she brings a lawsuit, what impact might that have on her ability to get a job somewhere else? People say, oh, this is a person who files lawsuits. So I would think that in some way acts as a kind of chilling effect for a lot of people who have a valid claim, and so, but for those reasons, don't bring that claim.
I think, unfortunately, that does, and that is probably one of the big reasons why we are so far behind. I mean, the Equal Pay Act was 50 years ago, more than 50 years ago, and we still have this disparity. So I think it's very important that people have the courage to stand up and sue. But as for retaliation, years ago we were about to hire a male person to the faculty, and then the head of appointments committee came around and said he was no longer a candidate. And I said, why not? He said, I'd rather not tell you. And I said, well, I want to know. And he said he sued his university. And I said, did he win? And the guy on our faculty said, that's not the issue. And I thought, wow. At a law school, not to care about whether somebody won or lost is pretty bad.
So so how did you have the courage to do this then? I mean, it seemed to me that somebody needed to do it, and I thought I was in a good position.
I'm not looking for a job at another school. I have a strong track record in Denver with students and members of the community who were very supportive. And I decided somebody ought to do it, and I should be the one. Now, it's much easier for me to do it because I have tenure. So I can't be fired. And I think one of the important things about this lawsuit is that those of us who wanted to are still working at the university and still having a good time teaching. So I think too often women feel that they have to quit their jobs in order to sue. And then that kind of muddies the field. You say, are they mad because they were fired or one thing or another? But we're all doing the same thing. Those of us who stayed on at the university are doing the same thing we were doing before, but we're getting paid appropriately now.
Well, and again, to come back to what we were talking about earlier, the defense that the school has to put up, where they have to come up with a non-discriminatory explanation. The way it played out here, and I'm sure this is true in a lot of situations where a claim of discrimination is raised, there is a blaming the victim, necessarily built into this. That they have to say, well, it's not us, it's actually you that is the problem. And I'd imagine that along with that, in a law school where or any university community where collegiality is so important, it can translate into a claim that actually you're being disloyal, that you're speaking out against the university, and that's a bad thing, right?
That's right.
But why isn't the bad thing the fact that the women were being discriminated against in the first place? It seems like that's...
I think definitely.
Right.
That is the bad thing, and that's what women have to realize, that they're not the bad people. It's the university. And in any case, it's the employer's obligation to pay people fairly. And I have a little trouble with the lean-in movement and negotiate and all that. That's, I think, a red herring. That is not the obligation of the employee to negotiate. It's the obligation of the employer to pay people equally. My feeling is all of us who are working have something that's more important than running around and finding out who's being paid how much. That's the employer's job.
Well, right. And of course, the law that we've been referring to that was passed in 1963, it doesn't put a burden on the employee. As you correctly point out, it puts a burden on the employer. And if the employer fails in that responsibility, then they can be held responsible, as happened in your case. So what lessons would you say you took from this experience that might be translatable to women in other working contexts? Obviously, yours is a university; it's a law school. We pointed out some of the unique features of your position in bringing this case, that you have years and years of students who came to your support. But what lessons do you think more broadly come out of your experience that would be translatable to women who believe they're experiencing pay inequality in other types of working situations?
One of the things that I would like to say to women is that I think the community as a whole strongly approves of equal pay. And I was struck, as I did lots and lots of media interviews, that the male interviewer, after the equipment was turned off, would tell me that he strongly supports equal pay because he wants to make sure his daughters get paid equally. And I think that is a very strong factor. I think people basically believe in fairness. And I think women, of course, want to be paid equally, and men want their daughters to be paid equally. Right. So I think it's time to put an end to this idea that you can get away with paying women less than men. Well,
and another interesting feature of these types of claims, pay inequality, is you don't, as I understand the law, you don't have to show an overt discriminatory intent on the part of the employer. You can show discriminatory results by looking at real numbers. I mean, the salaries don't lie. If this person's making 2 times what a female counterpart is earning, you've showed discrimination in its effect.
That's right. And I think that in any job there are different grades. You start at one level and then you get promoted to another level. People have said that it should be somewhat like the military. You might start as a sergeant, and then if you do a good job, you get promoted to whatever comes next. And if you're not doing a good job at the level you're at, you wouldn't get promoted to the higher level. So it could be fairly clear. If you're promoted to the higher level, fine, you deserve the higher pay that other people at that level are getting.
Right. I wonder what your thoughts are on this too, that, when we think about discrimination in its many expressions in our society, in our culture, in our workplaces today, it is often said that we have less overt discrimination where there's a malice and an intent to discriminate. But we still see the impact of discrimination because of implicit bias, more subtle, nuanced forms of discrimination. Do you, through your experience, what are your thoughts about that given your experience? Overt discrimination versus what may play out because of implicit biases?
I think there may well be some implicit bias. I don't feel that I've experienced a lot of it myself, basically because I have a fairly strong backbone and thick-skinned, and I feel I've been doing a good job. And certainly I'm not perfect, but the amount of work that I put in and the feedback I get from students and so forth. In other words, what I'd like to emphasize is that people should have confidence in what they're doing. They know they're doing a good job. And they should have that confidence and be willing to stand up for themselves.
Well, since the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963, a time in our country where we were taking a hard look at discriminations in many forms in our society and looking at the law and where there were major gaps in our law in terms of enforcing the principles of equality and fairness that on paper are what our Constitution is supposed to provide for everybody. But that was a long time ago. And yet here you come along 50 years later and find pretty clear case of pay discrimination against the women faculty. And as we were saying earlier, we know that this is a problem that still exists throughout the workforce in our country, where women typically, if you really look at true comparisons, are still only earning 80 cents on the dollar. That's an improvement over what it was when the Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963, but it's still a significant discrepancy. What do you think, again, having gone through this and really been a part of the playing out of a challenge to this inequity, what do you think explains the fact that we are still so far from parity in terms of pay?
I think it's an unwillingness of women to stand up and sue. So that filing a charge with EEOC is free. It doesn't cost you a thing. And then EEOC does the investigation. Mm-hmm. And I think there just has to be more emphasis by women and a recognition by employers. And every so often you read about an employer, I think Salesforce was one, that discovered that it had gender-based discrimination. So it put in about $3 million and cleaned it up. And then it bought some other businesses and checked them, and sure enough, they had gender discrimination. So I think it takes responsible leadership at the top to say, wow, there's something going wrong here. We're just plain going to correct it.
Mm-hmm. And maybe education, because maybe people don't realize that what they're seeing, first of all, is actually discrimination that can be the basis for a claim to the EEOC, and that the law actually can do something about it. So maybe one of the problems we have is that, in addition to the others that we talked about, fear, stigma, worries about retaliation, which are real. I mean, there are people earning a lot less than a law professor's salary, and probably worry greatly and with good reason over what would happen to them and their families, their children, if they lost that job. So I think those fears are probably very real and a source of valid concern. But maybe part of the problem too is that there needs to be more education about the fact that the law exists, that we're not talking about creating some new law. We have a law that exists and a basis for bringing these claims that actually can make a difference, as it did in your case.
Yes, and I hope that people will have a feeling, not only a responsibility to themselves, but to a future generation, so to speak. In other words, there were people to get women to vote. People demonstrated and marched, and that was a dangerous occupation to try to get the vote for women. And I think the current generation needs to step up to the plate and really work to get equal pay for women.
Well, you sent me this case out of Vermont. It has some wonderful language from the judge. This was a case from, a few years ago, brought by a woman who lost her job with one of the companies that operates, these newspaper magazine shops that we see in the airports. And she had lost her job after a lot of years in retail, and then was replaced by a younger male supervisor who immediately was earning more than she had earned when she had lost that job. And that led to a lawsuit in federal court in Vermont. And the opinion by the judge in support of that claim that she brought said this, and I thought this was really powerful and really telling. I just wanted to read this little bit of it. This judge, who was William K. Sessions, not the Sessions who was our former Attorney General, but Judge Sessions in Vermont, said, "In the 50 years since the passage of the Equal Pay Act, we've taken significant strides toward parity. In 1963, the female-to-male earnings ratio was 60%, and many of the country's leading colleges and universities were admitting their first female students. Today, the gap is markedly smaller, and women outnumber men in higher education. That progress justifies confidence, but not complacency. The convergence of wages has slowed in recent years, and in 2012, the wage gap actually increased slightly. Any gap in the pay of men and women, whether 40 or 10 or 1%, is an implicit statement to our children that we value the work of our daughters less than that of our sons. It sends a message that Congress, the Vermont General Assembly, and this court reject." And I think that goes to what you were saying about thinking of it not only in terms of ourselves, in your case, yourself, but what the significance is of this to our children, to our daughters.
Yes, I think that's very important. And on a note that people really understand, I think the women's soccer players are a good example. They've decided they're getting paid less than the male soccer players, worse accommodations on trips, and they're saying, okay, we're going to stand up for ourselves and for other women who want to engage in sports. And I think it's a really good example to the young people and to all of us.
Well, and I think there is encouraging news too in this sense. And some of the statistics that I referred to earlier, I got from the National Women's Law Center website, and they break down the pay gap for women in different demographic groups. And one of the things that I think is pretty interesting is that the wage gap is smaller for younger women. So, it still exists for women ages 15 to 24 working full time. They are typically paid 92 cents for every dollar their male counterparts are paid. That's still a gap, although a much smaller gap. For older women and for women of color, the gap is much more significant. For women 45 to 64, the gap is 76 cents to every dollar their male counterparts are paid. But I wonder if there is some encouraging news in the fact that younger women who not only are receiving higher education in greater numbers than when the Equal Pay Act was passed, but are probably daughters of mothers who, at this point, who benefited from access to higher education and what that signifies in terms of job opportunities and pay opportunities. Maybe that is at least some encouraging news. Not an indication that we should be complacent, as Judge Sessions said, but nonetheless a bright note of hope for the future in this area.
Yes, I agree with you that young people I think, have a very good spirit. And in the Denver area, the major law firms in Denver about 5 years ago were starting the graduates. We have 2 law schools in Colorado. And at both law schools, the graduates in the top 25%, the women graduates were starting at a salary of about $18,000 less per year than the men graduates from the same law school.
Oh my gosh.
In the top 25%. That gap is now gone in the Denver area.
Okay.
In other states, the big employers have said, okay, whatever we were doing in the past, that was wrong. We're going to start paying people equally.
It is amazing that only 5 years ago you had such a pay discrepancy, coming out of the same law schools into the same law firms. But good that problem is being corrected. And of course, there's still a lot of work to do outside of the legal business, the law business, and the law school business. In many other types of work environments, there's still a lot of work to be done on this issue. Lucy, thank you so much for being on Good Law, Bad Law, for sharing your story, the experience you had with this case, and your perspective on this issue. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.